world personally for around 10 years or so now, and it's my belief, now that I represent a jurisdiction particularly, that actually there's probably no better time to be on the buy side currently. If you're an investor, if you're a client, if you're a family, if you're someone that is looking to structure their wealth, there's probably no better time. The reason for that is the number of jurisdictions, or what we would class as offshore, or what we might term otherwise as an international finance centre, has grown tremendously over the last few decades. And so clients really are spoiled for choice now. That's great from one perspective, because it drives a lot of the right behaviours, but it can also prove challenging in helping to, or understanding how best to navigate that. So hopefully through the course of our panel session, our experts will help you navigate that carefully. I'll start, Michael, just by asking, what do you say to those who still speak in terminologies of tax havens and believe that offshore centres are still the hiding places for the wealthy?
Yeah, when I spoke last year at this, I referred to the fact that there had been an extinction event. In the same way as the dinosaurs were wiped out, 9/11 was an extinction event for those that think that they can hide assets. 9/11 was the end of secrecy, and nothing has changed since that other than an acceleration of the race to transparency, which is the new buzzword that we're all heading for. And you now have David Cameron saying that it is no longer fair to refer to the Crown dependencies or the overseas territories as tax havens. So we have made some progress in our race to transparency. Those that are late in the race, whether they can now paddle fast enough to catch up some of the emerging jurisdictions, because as we said, everybody wants to be an international finance centre now. Whether they're going to be able to do that, I don't know.
Cost always comes into somebody's decision-making process, but often the cheapest might not be the best. In the long term, it can often be the most expensive. So there are many, many countries around the world that offer favourable tax regimes for people who are living there for maybe a 10-year period. So I think it's interesting times ahead for us. So wealthy families, tax always plays a part in structuring, but it's not the only reason why clients set up offshore trusts and foundations. I mean, typically it's for long-term succession planning for the family, and these structures are put in place, and families want them to last for generations, and they want them to be in a regime that's stable and not constantly changing. I think international finance centres will continue to play a very important part in managing the wealth of a global family. But what will be really important will be a stable legislation, a strong regulatory framework that again is stable, and a stable political regime.
What we're finding now more than ever is that the world is increasingly complex, whether it's because of regulatory pressures, fiscal pressures, the transparency agenda that's coming up. Looking at our NRI client base in the UK, most of them do tend to be non-DOMs, and using the non-DOM status often requires structures, and Jersey really has built a reputation, particularly around trust work. They're so used to dealing with UK related assets and managing that sort of management and control aspect of it. So when we look at our various offices, we can certainly see some jurisdictions better placed than others. But overall, the theme is very much towards better regulated jurisdictions with the right skills and expertise on the ground.
When a client first considers the offshore jurisdiction that they are moving to for a given purpose, they will usually look for a professional intermediary in that jurisdiction to provide initial advice and to recommend other key professional advisors in that jurisdiction to understand the local requirements and how those local requirements tie in and dovetail with international legal and regulatory requirements, as well as those of the domestic jurisdiction from which the client resides or is domiciled in. I think what we're also seeing is some offshore jurisdictions being used as hop-off jurisdictions for UK residents looking perhaps to leave the jurisdiction, and where you might have had a first-generation family from India come and establish themselves over here and establish their businesses and really grow and create wealth. You have then perhaps those first generation individuals looking then to move back to India.
We are seeing quite a movement of family members, particularly, I think Indian families. There's a lot of movement of families across borders as well as their assets. And whilst a lot of them are acquiring assets across borders, we're seeing a huge trend towards them physically moving across borders, which creates opportunity for using offshore structures.
I think when you're looking at entering into a relationship in an offshore jurisdiction to look after family wealth, you're probably thinking that it will affect your children and very possibly your grandchildren. So you're looking at 3 generations. On that basis, it's actually one of the longest relationships that you're ever likely to enter into in your lifetime.
And I think it's really difficult for the government in these centres to get it right, because there's the balance between the clients wanting to have their assets in an environment that's safe and protected and well regulated, against taking regulation too far, which is then a barrier to businesses setting up there and people moving there.
But I think the determining factor, apart from good regulation and very good professional skill set in the jurisdiction, is to have some sort of real nexus, some sort of relationship with that jurisdiction, which is really the driving factor. And they want a responsive service, they want a good service, and it comes down to trust.
Well, I think the global transparency agenda is happening, and it's happening rapidly, and it's happening on a very sort of coordinated scale amongst different onshore, larger developed economies, driven by the OECD. So that's something which is happening, and it's something we all have to prepare ourselves for, and the clients. Yeah, the challenge there is managing the expectations of the client, as the information you will have to have on them, and which will need to be shared. And I think there might need to be some changes in terminology we use. So private banking and private client work might not be the right terminology anymore.
All of the jurisdictions are capable of changing their legislation very quickly if they need to do so. And in fact, the analogy has been said that they are like frigates. They can see which way the wind is blowing and they can take advantage of it very quickly. And that's very important.
So what do you think investors and clients think of offshore regulation in comparison to onshore regulation? I guess with our audience, I'm thinking specifically on the onshore side.
It's more a question for my corporate colleagues who are advising people who are setting up in the UK. But as I understand it, the UK regulations are very onerous. We have directives from Brussels, and clients, if they can, will try and stay out of the UK regulatory environment if they can, and would prefer to be somewhere with a light touch environment. But clearly, if you're doing business in the UK, then you're within the UK regulations.